Donald Trump finds himself in an increasingly precarious position as both international allies and domestic lawmakers publicly rebuke his latest controversial statements. His aggressive rhetoric toward Greenland, Denmark, Norway, and the broader NATO alliance has triggered a wave of condemnation that exposes the fragility of his current political standing. The former president's bellicose posturing serves a dual purpose. First, it represents an attempt to consolidate authoritarian power through the threat of military expansion. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it functions as a deliberate distraction from mounting scandals, the unsealed Epstein documents, concerns about his mental acuity, and a weakening economic outlook that contradicts his campaign promises. However, this strategy has spectacularly backfired. Rather than diverting attention, Trump has magnified scrutiny on every front. European leaders are now openly challenging his threats, making him appear weak and ineffective on the world stage. In what appears to be a desperate attempt to salvage his image, Trump abruptly canceled a scheduled event today, a move that signals his need for reassurance from his base of support. To understand the full scope of this unraveling, we must first examine how European leadership is responding to these threats with unprecedented unity.
Union supports Denmark and the people of Greenland, and we do so united in our resolve. The measures threatened over the weekend by the United States administration will not help improve security in the Arctic. In fact, they risk the opposite. Greenland and Denmark have both made clear that Greenland is not for sale, and that their sovereignty and territorial integrity needs to be respected. That fact will not change.
That statement represents more than diplomatic protocol, it's a direct warning to the incoming administration. Trump's approach to international relations has always been transactional, built on a foundation of leverage and intimidation. This mindset was cultivated during his formative years in New York real estate, under the mentorship of the notorious Roy Cohn, a figure who pioneered tactics of blackmail, threats, and public intimidation. Throughout his political career, Trump has deployed these same strategies. He threatens opponents with prosecution, primary challenges, and political destruction. His entire methodology depends on one assumption, that targets will ultimately bend to pressure, but European leaders are demonstrating precisely what causes Trump to collapse, refusing to submit. When his bluster is met with firm resistance rather than capitulation, his fundamental insecurity becomes apparent. The man who projects strength crumbles when confronted with actual resolve. As of January 2025, reports indicate that the European Union has strengthened its strategic partnerships in the Arctic region, particularly with Greenland and Denmark, establishing enhanced defense cooperation agreements that directly counter any potential American aggression. What makes this moment particularly devastating for Trump is that he lacks support even within his own party. Republican senators, including some of the most hawkish members of the caucus, are distancing themselves from his Greenland fixation. This domestic abandonment explains his increasingly erratic behavior and his desperate need to reconnect with his base through provocative actions. Senator Rand Paul's recent comments perfectly encapsulate why Trump is spiraling.
Do you think there would be enough Republicans to pass the legislation that Senator Kaine talks about on tariffs and potentially a second war powers resolution?
On the war powers or on militarily invading Greenland, I've heard of no Republican support for that, even though most hawkish members of our caucus have said they won't support that. So I think it's going to be very difficult. I think he keeps rattling the cage saying that. But as far as trying to buy it peacefully, you don't get purchasers to come around by berating them and telling them you'll take it anyway. So I don't think that's very successful. With regard to emergencies, this is the same debate the Supreme Court has before it right now. And I don't think that you can, through an emergency, say, well, the Constitution is no longer valid. The Constitution says taxes originate in the House, go to the Senate, and then go to the President for signature. It doesn't say the President can just write up new taxes and threaten them anytime he wishes. So I think this is unconstitutional. Now, he's pointed towards a statute that Congress passed called IEPA. I don't think that applies to trade either. And I think the court is going to strike this down, and it will be a significant rebuke to unchecked presidential power. The sooner the better, though, because the power continues to be used. And if it's going to be checked, the Supreme Court should go ahead and release its opinion as soon as we can.
Senator Paul.
There it is, direct confirmation from a Republican senator. not a single member of the GOP caucus supports military action against Greenland. Not Lindsey Graham. Not Ted Cruz. Even the most reliable defenders of executive power are unwilling to endorse this reckless fantasy. Trump now finds himself politically isolated on multiple fronts. He commands no authority internationally. He lacks legislative support domestically. And given his well-documented dietary habits and the conspicuous absence of the First Lady from public view, one might speculate about other deficiencies as well, though we'll spare everyone those mental images. This is the reality of Trump's current position, fundamentally weak, desperate for validation, and increasingly erratic in his attempts to regain momentum. Every move he makes now appears designed to energize his core supporters. The manufactured controversy around Somali immigration. Threats to arrest political opponents like Tim Walz. Baseless claims about detaining media figures. These are all calculated provocations meant to reignite passion among his base, which brings us to today's most telling decision, his unprecedented break with a 4-decade tradition that reveals exactly who Trump believes he must appease. Breaking news article, Trump skips MLK Day proclamation. Trump becomes the first president to skip Martin Luther King Day proclamation, breaking a decades-long tradition started by Ronald Reagan. For the first time since the federal holiday was established, a sitting U.S. president has failed to issue a proclamation honoring Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Donald Trump has shattered a tradition maintained for nearly 40 consecutive years by every president from Reagan through Biden. As of this publication, no MLK Day proclamation from Trump appears on the White House official website, social media platforms, or in the Federal Register. These proclamations are typically signed days in advance of the holiday. Even accounting for possible delays, the administration has made no effort to release such a statement in any timely fashion. For all practical purposes, Trump has chosen to ignore the presidential tradition of emphasizing this important civil rights commemoration. This absence represents a dramatic departure not only from precedent established by Ronald Reagan, but from Trump's own first term. Between 2018 and 2021, Trump issued MLK Day proclamations every single year without exception. Martin Luther King Jr. Day was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan in 1983 and first observed as a federal holiday in 1986. In his initial proclamation, Reagan stated that Dr. King's activism was rooted in genuine patriotism that cherishes American ideals while striving to close the gap between those ideals and reality. For 40 years, every president from Reagan through Joe Biden has issued annual proclamations recognizing this holiday. This year's omission is therefore completely unprecedented. The decision aligns with a broader pattern from Trump and his administration that has systematically diminished and rolled back federal recognition of civil rights observances. During Trump's first term, his administration eliminated both MLK Day and Juneteenth as fee-free entry days at national parks, replacing them with alternative dates including Flag Day on June 14, which happens to be Trump's birthday. At the time, the Department of the Interior described this new list, which excluded the MLK holiday, as a collection of patriotic fee-free days. Additionally, Trump removed the Martin Luther King Jr. bust that had been displayed in the Oval Office for years, a symbolic gesture that spoke volumes about his priorities. Meanwhile, Trump's political movement has grown increasingly hostile toward King's legacy. Prominent MAGA figures have begun openly attacking the civil rights leader's historical importance. Charlie Kirk, founder of Turning Point USA and a major promoter of Trump's campaigns, has argued that King was a bad guy unworthy of a federal holiday or commemorative statues. Kirk has even labeled the Civil Rights Act itself as a mistake. At least we're spared from hearing Kirk's commentary today, a small mercy in an otherwise troubling situation, but make no mistake about what this cancellation represents. Trump is sending a clear signal to his base, particularly at a moment when that base is showing signs of fracture. He's reassuring the most reactionary elements of his coalition that he remains aligned with their values, even as mainstream Republicans distance themselves from his more extreme positions. Why does Trump feel compelled to make such gestures now? Because he recognizes that his core supporters are beginning to waver. They're questioning why a man who promised to protect them from elite pedophiles has connections to Jeffrey Epstein. They're frustrated that their costs continue rising despite promises of economic relief. They're disturbed that resources previously allocated to healthcare subsidies are being discussed for territorial acquisition schemes and expanded immigration enforcement operations. Trump needs to remind these supporters that regardless of policy failures or international humiliation, he shares their cultural resentments. That's the transaction he's offering, symbolic gestures in exchange for continued loyalty despite material harm to their interests, and let's be absolutely clear about Trump's current strategic position: he has never been weaker. This is not hyperbole. At no point in his political career has Trump been so thoroughly exposed and isolated. He's not grasping at straws anymore. There are no straws to grasp. He's adrift without direction, without leverage, without the political capital necessary to advance any meaningful agenda. Consider the legislative reality. Speaker Mike Johnson is currently attempting to advance a new economic package through the House. He's soliciting input from Republican members about what they'd like to see included in this legislation. If Johnson genuinely believes he can pass substantive economic policy through Congress, he's profoundly mistaken. Republican members have no interest in legislating. They didn't pursue political power to exercise governance, they sought platforms for opposition and criticism. These are individuals who prefer sniping from the sidelines to the actual work of crafting policy. And right now, they're particularly angry. Representative Don Bacon has indicated he won't support Johnson's agenda. Johnson has been forced to pull multiple votes from the House floor because resignations and deaths within the GOP caucus have eliminated his working majority. As I've consistently emphasized, Mike Johnson doesn't currently have a functional majority in the House. When you're constantly withdrawing scheduled votes, when discharge petitions are succeeding against your wishes, when you're frantically insisting that you haven't lost control, that's precisely when everyone knows you've lost control. So Trump faces a legislative branch that cannot and will not deliver on his agenda, international allies who openly mock his threats, and a domestic political environment where even loyal Republicans refuse to endorse his most aggressive proposals. The upcoming midterm elections represent an existential threat to whatever remains of Trump's political project, assuming those elections are permitted to proceed. And that assumption deserves scrutiny. We must acknowledge that Trump has explicitly suggested canceling midterm elections. He's deploying ICE forces in major cities in ways that appear designed to test tactics for disrupting electoral processes in Democratic strongholds. Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta. These enforcement operations could serve as rehearsals for more aggressive intervention during election periods. The man who denies election results, who seeks to eliminate mail-in voting, who has floated the idea of suspending midterm elections entirely. Do we really believe he's primarily concerned with general approval ratings? Or is his focus on maintaining the enthusiasm of the core supporters who might tolerate or even support extra-constitutional measures? Trump clearly prioritizes feeding red meat to his base over winning broader public support. He needs to maintain the loyalty of those who would accept his most authoritarian impulses, not persuade those who oppose his agenda entirely. That's the calculation behind today's MLK Day snub. It's darkly ironic timing, given that every Republican politician typically uses Martin Luther King Jr. Day to perform concern about racial justice and systemic inequality. They pretend to have learned lessons from the civil rights movement. They claim they wouldn't have opposed that historical progress, despite the fact that some of them are literally old enough to have voted against the Civil Rights Act when it was originally proposed. Charlie Kirk called that legislation a mistake. But Kirk seems notably quiet today. Perhaps he recognizes that even his usual provocations might not land well on this particular occasion. This is the current state of the Trump administration, canceling MLK Day commemorations to score points with a base that's increasingly furious about his protection of powerful predators, his failure to deliver economic improvements, and his apparent interest in diverting resources from domestic needs toward vanity projects like territorial expansion. Trump is weaker now than at any previous moment. He's flailing, isolated, and desperate for any gesture that might stabilize his crumbling authority. The midterm elections will represent a massive repudiation of his agenda if those elections are allowed to proceed. And that's a qualification we cannot afford to ignore. Trump will attempt to interfere with the electoral process. He'll deploy every tool at his disposal to prevent or delegitimize results that threaten his power. But we cannot allow concern about that possibility to become paralysis. Recognizing the threat doesn't mean surrendering to it. We must simultaneously prepare for interference while organizing to overcome it. That means focusing energy on flipping critical seats. Texas, Maine, Minnesota, where we need to ensure Peggy Flanagan's success over challengers like Angie Craig. Every competitive race deserves maximum effort and attention. Calling out Trump's authoritarianism is essential. We'll continue doing exactly that on this platform. If you want to support this kind of direct commentary, subscribe to this channel. Leave a like on this video if you've stayed until the end. Drop a blue heart in the comments to show solidarity. Keep fighting. Don't let them silence you. Don't let them intimidate you. And don't let them convince you that resistance is futile. Until next time, stay strong.